Thank you, Jill, and thank you everyone for attending today. I hope you find this information interesting. As you are probably already aware, I don't think it's really a surprise to say that security and compliance are something that's sort of ongoing and changing. As a matter of fact, this morning I was looking at some updated CMMC stuff, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. The big message I would give to everybody on the call today is that we can't take this stuff for granted, and we should always be assessing. So we'll get through this today, and hopefully, if you have any questions as we go, please keep in mind we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So just a brief intro. 2020 would have been a very transformative year for security compliance, even if we didn't have the new normal. Obviously around March, work changed for pretty much everybody. So as a result of COVID, but even before then, CMMC really starting in 2019 really created new compliance concerns for defense contractors and their vendors. And it's not just the Defense Department. When you think about these big regulatory rules that come out, they tend to impact people outside of it. That other organizations look at these rules as a way to create their own standards. There are people who may not work directly with the federal government, but work for people who work for the federal government. And so these things tend to reverberate. And so CMMC created a whole new ripple effect for that. On the other side, GDPR on the European Union continues to push organizations that collect PII towards implementing data collection management and disposal controls. So that's been going on for a couple of years now, and it's starting to have an impact in Europe, and then that's also being extended to the United States. Similar to CMMC, how that tends to approach federal contractors and people who work at the Department of Defense. GDPR really impacts anybody who does business with European citizens, which then reverberates into other areas of the private sector. Several states are implementing their own privacy and data laws. So a couple examples here would be CCPA out of California. You have, I believe, New York and Massachusetts has laws. I know in the Maryland State Legislature, they're discussing their own data privacy laws. And I honestly think it's only a matter of time before here in Maryland we have a specific sort of personal information privacy law in line with that. And so you can expect these things to continue. At the same time, phishing continues to be this really major threat, and the cloud has pushed us to focus less on server closets and more on devices and access to data. So, I started in the MSP space in 2005, and back then, a lot of the focus on cybersecurity was what devices do we have, how do we support them, how do we patch and manage them, which is still important today. But everything was very centralized in personally owned devices and personally owned server closets and things like that. Now, what we're trying to see is that a lot of these data breaches are happening either on the account level or the personal level. You have inadvertent volunteering of information when people are phished and then give up information to a bad guy even though they don't think it's a bad guy. And so this is impacting security and compliance, because if we're going to create these standards and create ways to manage and create a discipline with this, we have to focus on what the threats are today, and a lot of them are focused on the user. So today I want to go through a few things, and you can't possibly talk about every piece of compliance management in a 45-minute-ish webinar. So I'm just going to talk about a few things, and if you want to get more specific, we can either talk about it offline or do some Q&A. First is the sort of basic regulatory overview, and getting back to the points I mentioned earlier, CMMC, GDPR, and state level laws. Sort of looking towards the future so we can understand where things might be as we approach 2021. I think it would be kind of foolish to just think of compliance as where it's going to stand today. We should be creating good practices and good disciplines so that as these things change, because they will change, we can adapt with them and become better at managing security and risk. I want to talk about proper security and management of personal mobile devices. So this can sort of be outside the whole compliance discussion, but now for many organizations, especially ones that have brick and mortar offices, and have changed the way they work as a result of the pandemic, we have to look at personal and mobile device management a lot differently. I've talked about this a little bit in the past when it comes to working from home. I think now, I think now we need to revisit that. Training, testing, and user awareness. There is an increased focus on this as a part of compliance standards, as well as just general good practices. The investments we make in our people to make sure that they are secure and compliant, that they make good decisions, that they act in secure interest and risk management interests on behalf of the company or organization is really going to pay dividends. So I really encourage people to focus on what can we do to make our people one of the best cybersecurity risk management approaches as opposed to the risk themselves. And then new considerations when evaluating risk testing and road mapping technology. So now that we're here and we're doing all this stuff, what should we consider now that we really weren't considering before when it comes to long-term planning and design? And then just some tips and general ideas. So there were some things, they didn't really fall into a particular bucket, but I thought that would touch on them anyway, and then Q&A. So where do we stand on compliance in September 2020? And as I said, as we connected on the call, I was literally reading a new DFARS interim rule. So literally things are changing by the day. And it was regarding CMMC. So CMMC is called the Cyber Security Maturity Model Certification. You have to excuse me, I'm not really great with my acronyms, but the idea is that for organizations, for those of you who aren't directly available, organizations that work with the Department of Defense and control something called controlled unclassified information or federal contract information, that there are standards that they need to meet. Most of these standards align with the NIST 800-171 framework, which has been out there for a long time. And depending on the level of risk of your organization for a data breach, you could fall into one of 5 levels of CMMC compliance. As you might imagine, those different levels ask you to do different things and have different assessments. We can't get into on this call everything about CMMC, but the idea is that if you control this information that the government has interest in, you're probably going to be needing to be compliant and have a good framework in place. As far as CMMC today, there is a phased rollout. Just in the interim rule I was reading this morning, they expect full implementation by September 2025. However, for organizations that are already doing business with the Department of Defense or perhaps are bidding on contracts, they're going to have an expectation that once you are awarded the contract, that you are aligned with CMMC and you're moving in that direction. So they don't want you to get the contract and then say, okay, well, in 3 years, I'm going to be CMMC compliant. The expectation is going to start being that I have the tools in place to be compliant today. GDPR, so in terms of what's happened, the requirements haven't changed too much. One of the big focuses that has shifted over the past year has been on data transfers and justification for transfers. So to think about a few risks there, one is, what is the risk that when I'm transferring information, let's say, Jill's on the line with me and I want to send a sensitive piece of information to Jill, whether she's in my organization or not. First, the question is, well, what's the method in which I transfer this information? Am I transferring it in a way where when it goes onto the public internet that is encrypted and not readable by some person who's just sniffing data off of internet traffic? Furthermore, they're going to ask is if Ben says he needs to send Jill this information, is Jill really entitled to this? Should Jill be getting this information? How can we verify that Jill is the person who should be getting this information, or is the person that she says she is and not some hacker in Eastern Europe or something like that? So there's been increased scrutiny on that transfer piece. And as far as fines are concerned, GDPR did say that we're going to start fining organizations that have had breaches, and there have been some fines. In particular, I believe Google and Facebook have received GDPR fines. Now, these fines have, compared to the scope of these gigantic corporations, been very small, but they want to show that there's teeth to this stuff. So GDPR is starting to go after organizations for not meeting the requirements. State laws. So as I mentioned earlier, California has CCPA in place now. And that's not just them. I mean, Massachusetts, New York, et cetera, as soon to be Maryland, most likely. They are putting these requirements in place that I talk about protecting PII. Now, these state laws often are not just focused on the cybersecurity requirements that we would want to see in place, such as having good encryption, backing up data, patching your systems, taking inventories, so on and so forth. But a lot of the state laws are also focused on proper handling of PII, the manner in which you collect PII, how you dispose of PII, and the rights of individuals that you collect information on. If some company, I would expect in the future that if some company starts carrying personal information on you, there's going to be legal requirements saying that I could reach out to them and say, hey, I, Ben Schmirler, no longer give you permission to carry this information on me. I want you to dispose of it. GDPR does that. Now the state laws are moving in that direction as well. So you need to start thinking about that if you're starting to carry personally identifiable information. So what may be next when it comes to compliance? One is, and this is a big part of CMMC, and I think you're going to see it in other organizations or other compliance standards as well, which is demonstrations or documentation on your compliance as a matter of business. So CMMC says that you have to have DFARS assessments of some kind. There's basic, medium, and high level assessments. Most people have to do basic that say that you've gone through, that you've looked at whether you meet the NIST 800-171 standards or whatever standards you need to meet, and that you have a system plan, a security systems plan of action, so that you can say that, well, this is how we were assessed in September of 2020, and here's the plan that we're going to take to improve our risk profile into the future, so that you're not just checking off a box and saying, hey, yeah, I'm compliant, don't worry about it, I'm okay here. They're going to want to see some meat on those bones. In the recent interim rule that was published by the government regarding DFARS, they even said that there's some recognition that that the government knows that there's some sort of checking of boxes going on. And I think that's a bad sign if you're trying to bury your head in the sand about this, because the government is looking for people who are showing significant negligence when it comes to meeting these standards. It may not be enough to attest your compliance in order to do certain kinds of business. So even with the basic assessment from CMMC, the expectation is that you can produce this documentation at any time, even if you're self-assessing. Another area that I think we'll see some focus in the future is this thing called data graveyard disposals. So to summarize, there are vast amounts of unused old data which create liabilities on old environments, especially as we shift to the cloud. So consider where a lot of the organizations are today. Maybe some of the people on this call are this way, which, in the past they had the server closet and they had maybe a few boxes in place. Those boxes had a bunch of hard drives on it, and that was where we kept all of our information for years and years and years. And then one day we decided, you know what, we're going to utilize Microsoft Azure, we're going to utilize Office 365, or we're going to use these other cloud-based systems, or we're just going to replicate what we have into the cloud, whatever. And then all this old stuff sits around, and maybe sits around the office for a while, or hopefully not, just gets thrown into a dumpster somewhere. Compliance standards are going to start looking at how are you disposing of this data and what kind of certifications do you have. Now, this is already in place for certain requirements, but there may be an increased focus on this as we see more server closets, especially in the small business, go away. And we don't want people, walking into, for example, a Goodwill and being able to pull a computer off the shelves and seeing all of this client data on it, because those things are happening right now. More user training and awareness will continue. You're starting to see a lot more explicit requests for security training and compliance programs, security awareness programs. I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the best investments you can make is in your people, to make sure that they are aware of the threats out there, that when the time comes to click or not click the malware attachment, or to share information with a hacker that you shouldn't be sharing, that awareness from the user will pay huge dividends. Technology can only go so far, and a lot of detection and response solutions are great at detecting and responding to attacks, but may not be able to stop a user from falling for these things in real time. So I expect there to be more user training and awareness needs in the future. There's definitely going to be more focuses on collection and transparency. So as I was talking about GDPR, as you collect PII or whatever kind of sensitive data you have, there's going to be a lot of questions about how you collect this data, how transparent are you about carrying this data, what rights the subject matter, the person who's the subject matter of the information, what kind of rights they have. So it's really important that you know if you're collecting something that's sensitive, who really has the right to that information, and what do you do to protect their interests, including their interest of maybe getting rid of it on your systems. Moving on to personal and mobile devices. So as I mentioned, there were already considerable requirements in order to use personal and mobile devices in a secure and compliant environment. It's not like COVID happened and then all of a sudden everybody was concerned about somebody who was working from home or someone using their personal iPhone to access information. However, once COVID did happen, using personal devices and mobile devices became a lot more normalized and a lot more significant. I don't think that's a particularly crazy thing, and it makes sense in a lot of organizations. But we need to start really focusing on how we manage those devices, because if we're not taking care of it, we're going to likely have a data breach. So one thing is, first of all, having inventories and permission. So we should know every device that has access to our sensitive information. So obviously most organizations will buy for their employees a PC or a laptop or something that they can use for their work, their day-to-day work. Maybe it's in the office. But if someone just wants to use their personal iPhone or their personal Android phone, or maybe they have a computer in the office they use, me personally, I have a laptop that I use and I take it around and I do most of my work on it. However, I have my own personal Android phone, and I also have a desktop that I use at home, and on occasion on my desktop at home I do some work on it. Oftentimes it's writing. I created this slide deck on my personal laptop. I'm sorry, my personal desktop. And so it's really not enough just to patch them up, but we should also have a sense of what devices people are using. It would be nice to know if my personal desktop was compromised, that we had some sort of vision on it, so that we didn't just see that this data breach didn't just happen behind the scenes and nobody knew about it. So we definitely need to take inventory. Centralized mobile device management to control rights to apps and data access. So if we're not using MDM already to have kind of a bird's eye view and basic hygiene on these personal devices, then we're really creating some serious risks to our organization. We could control and manage and patch all of our systems, and then some personal device is not properly secured and is just leaking data constantly. There's really no excuse. We can't have that in place. Devices need to be in a supportable state as well as the apps running on them. So, now for people working from their homes, they can't really be using an iPhone 4 or an old Android phone or an old tablet that's not patched up isn't really going to pass muster, because those devices are just waiting to be exploited. Vendors do have end of life on their hardware, and you're going to be affected by that. Once those devices aren't supported anymore, it's basically a ticking time bomb before they can be exploited. The risk level grows every day. Same with the apps. There are so many apps in these app stores right now, and it'd be foolish to expect that Apple and Google and some of these other companies that publish apps are doing everything that they can to keep these apps secure and safe. So we need to make sure that we use MDM and that we use some kind of app control to make sure that we're not putting on applications that are doing bad things on our phones, our tablets, things like that. If we don't want to implement security controls on personal devices, we just shouldn't use them. It's a choice. So I know there's a lot of resistance in many organizations. I don't know why it just did that. Sorry about that. There are many organizations where an executive perhaps is using their own iPhone and they don't want to deal with the MDM, or they don't want to. I don't want something on my computer. I don't trust this application on my computer. Why do you get to touch this? Well, it's a choice. Either we're going to have security on personally owned devices, or we're not going to be able to use those personally owned devices on company assets, company data assets. This data is too vulnerable. It's too much of a liability to the organization that we can't just let a few bad apples or a few sour grapes, whatever. We can't let them control our security risks by just tossing their weight around. Training, testing, and awareness. So as I mentioned, this is becoming an increased focus on organizations for compliance management. I know that I've actually seen, especially since the pandemic started, a lot more clients engage with us on the phishing and security awareness training we do. I think that's not by accident. Phishing attacks have gone up significantly since, it was already going up entering 2020, and it's gone up even more since the start of COVID because these hackers know where the attacks are. Older standards really focused on technology and now are really pushing more towards user vulnerabilities. There's no antivirus I can install or no firewall I can install where if somebody sends you an email, let's say Karen Shell, the president of the company, sent me an email and saying, hey Ben, I want you to give me this sensitive piece of information right now. And I decided, here you go, Karen. And I didn't pay close attention. It wasn't actually Karen. It was someone mimicking Karen's email address. There's no solution to stop that. It has to be on me as the individual to know that about the information that I'm sharing outside the organization. Phishing testing should really be strongly considered. So our program, we do it quarterly at minimum. For some clients, we do it even more. And the reason is that, the facts and the numbers are, I haven't done a scientific study with the clients that we've done this on. But I can tell you that when I start phishing testing organizations and I start sending them a test that says that here are the new COVID policies from HR and they fall for the test, or I send them a free offer on Amazon and they fall for the test, the next time the user is much more aware of what they're doing and they tend to click less things and the results tend to go down on the click rates. Nobody's perfect. We're never going to stop people from making mistakes on their computers. But if we can reduce that risk by, say, 50%, then we're 50% less likely to have a serious attack that could lead us to serious legal liabilities, serious system liabilities, so on and so forth. More on training. Some of the topics that I would consider, even if you don't work with us on this stuff, there's some certain topics that everyone should have when it comes to security awareness for users. So please make sure to write these down, or you can download the webinar later. Social engineering. So we need to talk about what people do to manipulate individuals when it comes to things that are happening on their computers. What do people do to get you to trust them and click on things and do things you shouldn't? The proper use of social media. People need to know that their Facebook page isn't where they should be airing sensitive information or having chats with people. Maybe, they go on their Facebook Messenger and start having business conversations with other employees within the company. Well, that's not really the company system. We shouldn't have that kind of chatter on social media. Same thing for LinkedIn, who we network with, or what we say on Twitter, or pictures we post on Instagram. We need to talk about the proper use of social media. You might want to talk just overviews of specific compliance standards for your organization. So I talked about CMMC, there's PCI, HIPAA, DFARS, I could go on and on. I think it's good for everybody to know, here is the standard we need to meet. We're not going to create a bunch of HIPAA experts or CMMC experts with this kind of training, but people should know, what is the data that we need to be compliant in protecting? How does this impact us? What are the consequences to our organization? What is the big picture idea of protecting this data, and what does it mean to you? What are the goals of the compliance standard, in other words? Because if we understand the goals, then when something is unclear, we can use good judgment to act accordingly. Acceptable use. This is a really important one as well. So what is and is not allowed to be done on computers and devices, both personal and company owned, as it pertains to sensitive data. So on your work PC, you have this much personal browsing you're allowed to do, or none at all. When you're remoting in, here's what we expect when you remote in. Here is what we consider sensitive data, and which sort of goes to my next point, and what you can do with it and what you can't do with it. Here are some other rules, like don't share passwords, other things that are like the ground rules for using a device. I put in another point for defining sensitive data. A lot of organizations don't really do this. where you could go through all of the information that you collect in your servers, in your email, your databases, et cetera. And they haven't really defined, and for what reason, what data is sensitive and how they want to protect it. So you might think of, HR, payroll information, or client information, trade secrets, contracting data in the case of CMMC, credit card data in the case of PCI. We should be able to list all of these things and assign different values to them. So, maybe, for example, the marketing information and our case studies that Jill and I are writing that are of value to us as an organization for DP, we don't want them to just go out into the ether, but it's not the same as if all of the social security numbers for people in the company went out into the internet. So anyway, the point is we need to define that stuff, and it should be somewhere where everybody can see it. Outlining different kinds of attacks. One thing I often assign as part of our training is here's the things you might expect. Here's some simulated attacks. This is what a social engineering type exercise might look like for you. I think that can be kind of helpful because it's easy to talk about these things, but sometimes demonstrating them can be useful as well. Communications management. So here, how do you communicate with people in the event of a data breach or something that happens to your computer, or verifying someone's identity or whatever? What are the channels? Who can people report to if they suspect something happens? What does our IT support look like, and how do we reach out to them? There's all sorts of things that can be talked about, but knowing how to communicate with one another is really an important thing when talking about security awareness. As I mentioned, and I'll probably keep saying it 5 more times before the webinar is over, the engagement from your staff will really make a tangible difference in limiting risk and avoiding attacks. An engaged, aware group will be hit a lot less than a group that has a much more blasé approach to security awareness. These things are super important. Again, it's hard to invest in every kind of tech out there, so awareness is your best return on investment. That's just a fact. There are some very, very sophisticated security solutions out there that probably cost a lot of money. Sometimes a better choice for that money is to put it into, or a smaller chunk of that money is to put it into that training area. New evaluation considerations right now. So with vulnerability testing, there's been a huge shift to focus on the device and less on servers. And the reason, and not to say that server vulnerabilities aren't important, but the idea is that a lot of organizations now are utilizing public cloud environments. And we're not going to be testing Microsoft Azure's infrastructure all that often. Microsoft themselves has to do that. They have their own certifications that they need to meet. But Microsoft in their Azure environment can't do much about your personal laptop not being well patched. So there's going to be more focus. There already was a focus on device testing, but I think now a lot of organizations need to look at that as a major, major area of risk. Internet of Things, IoT, will present new endpoints to exploit. So while all of this stuff is happening with the cloud, while we're working from home, another thing is happening, which is that we have devices in our homes and our offices that have Wi-Fi or Ethernet on them. They either communicate on the same networks as our sensitive information, or actually process that information as a part of our business. Maybe some manufacturing device has a networking port in it and data flows through it. These devices are going to be exploitable, and they've got operating systems of some kind of firmware or backend on them that could be exploited. As we move forward and as we assess our systems, we have to start looking at those non-traditional devices and what risks they have. Everything moving forward will need to focus on remote users and remote access. So again, I don't think this is a surprise. Encryption in transit and authentication into systems will be critical. So if you're not already doing multi-factor authentication to make sure that when you're logging into a system that has sensitive data in it, that there's some kind of extra token to ensure that you are the person connecting to it, you're a little bit behind right now. And I think you really should look at that, especially if you're working remotely, which I imagine most of you have some kind of remote presence on. I just think that this is really, if I was a bad guy and I was looking to exploit people, it would be going after these remote workers who are just have a username and password, because cracking a password is really not that challenging in the big scheme of things. Rights management, another area, as I said, if I'm going to exploit someone and I'm going to do a social engineering attack or a phishing attack to try and either gain access to that user's account or get someone to volunteer information using that user's account, then I want to make sure that the people who have access to data have access to the information and system rights that they need and no more. I, Ben Schmerler, don't need access to everything in DP Solutions systems. That wouldn't be correct. That wouldn't be right. It's not necessary for my job. And if for some reason I was exploited, we have to limit what people can have access to. So it's really important that we manage people's rights accordingly. There's going to be also an increased focus on how you respond to incidents. So there's a reality that's growing, which is that it's not a matter of if you're going to have a security incident within your organization, but when you have this incident. So how you respond to these things, how you communicate these things up the line, how you assess what happened after the fact and minimize risk as a result of it. All of these things are going to be an increased focus for all the compliance assessments and the way you manage your system into the future. So a few tips and ideas before we get into the Q&A. So be mindful of shadow IT. This was something we've been talking about for a while, but I think with people working from home, there is even more opportunity for people to say, I'm just going to put this on my personal thumb drive, or I'm just going to throw this in my personal Google Mail account or something like that. We can't have that. And so maybe this should have been on the security awareness slide in terms of topics to go over, but people should know what systems they are allowed to use and what systems they are not allowed to use, in particular as it pertains to sensitive information. I would look for services that speak to specific compliance and data privacy standards. So there are many good systems out there, especially cloud-based systems that do a job, right? They are your CRM, they're your sales management tool, they are your email system, their file server, whatever they are, and they do a great job, but they might not meet the requirement you need. Case in point, organizations that need to meet CMMC have a variety of requirements that they need to meet to secure controlled unclassified information, CUI. One good way to move towards that is to use Azure's government cloud services, because if you're using that, you're already sort of buying into a solution that deals with a lot of these compliance concerns. Just because a service is quote unquote secure doesn't mean it necessarily meets the compliance standards you need. When you're shopping these vendors, and this is something we can talk about offline, but when you're shopping these vendors, you should be able to ask them, hey, we are a HIPAA organization, or we're a CMMC organization. What do you guys do to address these compliance concerns? And if they don't have a good answer to that, you might not want to do business with them, even if it's a good company. Centralize, standardize, and automate your solutions whenever possible. So we need to keep things as minimally complicated as possible. I know that there are benefits for giving everybody the burger the way they want it, right? Have it your way, the Burger King mentality when it comes to how they use their computing and their technology. But every time we add a solution that is acceptable to do work, we create more things to patch, more things to manage, more things to maintain, and less overall control. I think we really should be trying to standardize as much as possible. And when we add things into the solution stack, we should make them as easy to monitor, as easy to maintain as we possibly can. Because the more we add, inherently, the more risk and cost we're adding on the back end. Be mindful of the fact that these standards will change. So while a framework is important, we should be keeping an open mind about what risks could be out there to stay ahead of the curve. We're talking about things right now in 2020, but in the future, this will change. And a couple takeaways from that. One is we just shouldn't rest on our laurels and assume that what we're doing now will be okay in the future. But more to the point, if we're not doing what we need to right now, when these things change, it's going to be a much more painful change for us. You know, if we're not using compliance solutions right now, if we're using end of life technology, or we're not training people right now, or we haven't defined what sensitive information is, and then we get slammed with a new compliance requirement on top of that in 2021, it's going to be so much harder to meet compliance standards, and we're going to look so much worse if we're going to deal with a contract that requires us to have a compliance level, or a partner that requires us to do this stuff. So I would really have a structure for this today, and then with the idea that we're going to be reassessing this perhaps every year, and we're going to look about where our risks are today as they were perhaps 1 year ago. Just because we aren't asked to do something, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. So I did this again. I don't know why. I don't know why PowerPoint's doing that. But the point is, multi-factor authentication is a great example. A couple of years ago, I remember PCI said it was a requirement only for remote access to have multi-factor authentication in place, and that changed, or it was an optional requirement to do it just for remote access. And the truth is, now it's considered to be a given that we implement multi-factor authentication. So we have a choice. We could just say, well, let's go through the list and just do everything on the list and check off all the boxes. Or we could say, well, let's go through the list, but also let's think a little bit broader here and think about risk as a whole and what would be a good idea to implement. And if it's not too painful, if it's something that that would benefit us and minimize our risk, we should probably be doing it now rather than being told to do it. Just in this in DFARS interim rule that was published today, they're making it so that they want it so that when you are awarded a contract that you're compliant. How can you be at that point if you're just waiting to be told you need to have a security management plan in place? So anyway, I'm just going to conclude while we wait for our Q&A, but the only constant is change. Risk will evolve with the technology as well as current events. I don't think that's going to surprise anything. COVID-19 really pushed us towards trends that were already sort of happening. You know, we already sort of had systems that were pushing us towards utilizing the cloud, towards getting people an anytime, anywhere workplace. But with people working from home with COVID, that's just pushed us even further in that direction, as I mentioned right there. We should really keep an open mind and really consistently reevaluate our technology and the controls in place to make sure the plan still meets our needs. Having these conversations, spending a little bit of time reevaluating and taking that bird's eye view, you know, once a quarter, once a year, depending on what works for your organization, will lead to better outcomes. So anyway, what questions do you have? Let's talk about it. While you're getting your questions in and while Jill's getting them together, I do want to talk about our next webinar real quick. It's going to be on October 28th, which is last Wednesday of the month, as usual. We're going to revisit multi-factor authentication, single sign-on SSO, and unified endpoint management, UEM. I remembered all of those acronyms, which is, I know, one of my challenges. So we're going to talk about these key security controls you need for the new normal, because I think these three components are going to be very important for people as we continue to deal with work into the future. So anyway, with that said, Jill, do we have any questions that I can answer?
Yes, we have a few that came in, but as a reminder, just go ahead and type them in the question box and we'll get to them in order. Yes. So our first question is, if I don't know what kind of compliance my company is subject to, how do I get started? What is your advice on how to get started?
Sure. The first thing is always to define on a business level what things we carry that are risky, right? Take out the technology and say, okay, what information do we carry in our organization that we don't want getting out or we can't lose? What is the actual technology risk to us? And so we could put them all on a piece of paper and say, these are the things we care about. Some of this may apply specific to a compliance standard. So let's say you're collecting names, phone numbers, addresses of people in Europe. Well, I mean, you need to be GDPR compliant, right? You know, now you've discovered your compliance standard. But let's say you still don't really know what your compliance standard is. My advice is to say, I'm going to pick a good framework, a well-respected framework like a NIST 800-171 or the CIS top 20 controls, which you can find online, very easy search on Google, CIS top 20, and say, well, what are we doing to address these general areas of risk management, of compliance? Put that in place, use a good framework, and that way, if, let's say, down the line, the HIPAA police are knocking on your door, or the CMMC police are knocking on your door, and that's, I shouldn't say police, it's not exactly how it works, but let's say they're knocking on your door and saying you need to be compliant. You can say, okay, well, I'm not, I didn't know I needed to be CMMC, but here's what I've done. Here's the framework and the security controls that I've put in place to manage my data and meet best practices. You may already be there. A lot of times, the organizations who needed to meet CMMC or were notified this last fall, they flipped out. They were really worried about this stuff because it's this big, intimidating document with all these standards in it and outlines, but they were already doing 80 or 90% of it. They already had patch management in place. They already had maybe a detection response in place. They already had a phishing testing program in place. They already had good policies in place. And so maybe they needed to trim around the edges a little bit, but they were in a good place. That's how I would recommend approaching it. I don't think it's enough to say, I don't have a compliance standard in place, so I'm just trying to do a few good things. I think you need to take the proactive approach of saying, okay, I don't think I have a compliance plan in place, but I'm going to document and create a security control myself, or I'm going to create a standard myself that we're going to assess against until otherwise known.
Okay, great advice. Another question, how often do these standards change, and how often can I expect to make changes to my compliance plan?
Yeah, so it's a complicated question because depending on the standard, it may change more or less, how complicated it is, what level of risk it is, so on and so forth. If you are CMMC level 1, which is just basic security hygiene, things are not going to change that dramatically from year to year. But they could change much more dramatically the higher risk you get and higher up the food chain you go. The standards are always changing, but I think this speaks to the previous point, which was if you have a good assessment plan in place and you say, okay, well, here's our requirements today, and we're trying to meet this standard, these changes are generally not earth-shattering. As I mentioned with PCI, they changed their approach on multi-factor authentication a few years ago. That it was I think it was optional until a certain point but recommended for multi-factor authentication, and then it became a part of the requirement. Well, if you're already moving in the direction of multi-factor authentication, then that rule change didn't really impact you all that much. So the answer is they're always changing, but it's kind of a slow burn. But I mean, look, if you decided that, I like to exercise in the morning. If I decided that I'm not going to work out for 6 months, I'd be in bad shape after 6 months. And so, and it'd be a lot harder to get back to being fit. But if I said I'm going to work out for 6 months, and then 6 months from now, I'm going to tweak my fitness plan because of my personal trainer said I needed to do something differently, that's not as big of a deal to deal with. I would look at compliance in a similar way.
Okay, excellent. I think we do have one more question in. How do the compliance standards impact the partner businesses that I work with?
Yeah, so the answer is it probably does impact them. CMMC, for example, runs their requirements down the line depending on the level of data that flows down. So let's say the Department of Defense works with you as a direct contractor. Maybe you're, for example, providing them with a widget of some kind, just to make it abstract. You're providing them with a widget, and so you carry CUI, but you get your components for that widget from another contractor that contracts to you, and there is some passing of CUI down from you to that contractor. That means the contractor to you is now needing to be compliant with CMMC. But the difference is the level of data that flows down. So let's say you are that same contractor, and the company you work with, the vendor you work with, is doing your they're building a new roof on your building or something like that. Well, if they're not carrying CUI, as part of the business they do with you, or they're not touching CUI as part of the business they do with you, then they're not required to be compliant. It's all a matter of the information shared between partners. So if you start getting into areas where you're, trickling compliant data to your business partners, then you need to have a conversation with your business partners about what they're doing to meet these standards. And if the answer is nothing, or they're not willing to talk about it, then you're putting yourself at risk by doing business with them and sending that information ahead. So it's very important that your partners have some kind of security standard in place, but it all depends on the level of data exposure you have to them.
Okay, great. And that concludes all the questions that we have, but of course you guys are welcome to reach out directly to Ben if you think of something after the webinar ends. And with that, we can go ahead and wrap up.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope this information was useful. Please make sure to register for next month's webinar. We also have a lot of good content that we're putting on the website right now, blogs. We've been doing tech tips videos, all sorts of things. We're really trying, as we always do, but even more so in our current times, we're trying to provide people with education, ideas, guidance, all free stuff. So just make sure to check all that out, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. We would love to talk about it.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
All right, take care.